Thank you. And let's, want to thank the National Governors Association and congratulate them for the COVID-19 Excalibur Award from AURP. So our next session is going to be on the Bayh-Dole Act at 40, why it still matters. We have a distinguished panel here, and I'm going to introduce all the panelists, and then we're going to start with Joe Allen. So Joe Allen is president of Allen and Associates. You'll hear from Joe about the instrumental role he had in when he was working in the Senate on the Bayh-Dole legislation. Next, after that, we'll have Kathy Koo, Chief Licensing Advisor for Wilson Sifoni, Goodrich, and Rosati, which is a well-known law firm that handles tech licensing and tech commercialization issues and patent issues. And before that, Kathy was at the Stanford Tech Transfer Office, which again is one of the best known tech transfer offices in the country. And then last we'll hear from John Stanford, who's Executive Director of Incubate, which is a association of venture capitalists and investors and biotech executives. And he'll talk about the role of Incubate in helping support the Bayh-Dole Act. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Joe Allen to give an overview of his work on the Bayh-Dole Act, and then Kathy, and then John, and we'll have a general discussion. So Joe, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Brian. It's really a pleasure to be here. As Brian mentioned, AURP didn't exist 40 years ago, nor would we be having a meeting like this 40 years ago, and there's a very good reason for it. Because 40 years ago, the government had a policy that if there's even a small percentage of federal funding involved on campus and an invention was made, the government would take that invention away to Washington and try to make it available through non-exclusive licensing. And while that sounded like a magnanimous policy, what it did is it doomed the chances of commercialization, because as all of you know who manage intellectual property or deal with inventions, a federally funded invention is an idea, not a product. And if you don't have a company willing to take a lot of time and a lot of money, and normally we're dealing with small companies, it'll never reach the market. So what happened was, before Bayh-Dole, the government had 28,000 inventions that had taken away, and it was licensing less than 5%. Even more shocking, when I was on Senator Bayh's staff, we found out that not a single drug had been commercialized from NIH-funded research under those policies, despite billions of dollars going into it and cutting-edge research coming out of it. So what happened was, in an election year very much like this, Senator Birch Bayh, a Democrat, and Senator Bob Dole, a Republican, worked together to try to solve that. And also should add, one of the worst parts of the pre-Bayh-Dole era was that companies would not fund research on campus because they were justly afraid that if they had funded an invention and there was government funding involved, that would be taken away from them. So the reality was that our public and private sectors were not working together to solve common problems. Now, fast forward 40 years later. We have 3 new companies and 3 new technologies commercialized every day of the year from academic research. The US has reestablished its lead in every field of technology. A study that was done just a couple of years ago found that academic patent licensing contributes 1.7 trillion with a T dollars to our economy, and is supporting 6 million new jobs between 1996 and 2017. There's no country in the world that comes even close to those numbers. What's the reason for that turnaround? It's because of the Bayh-Dole Act. What the Bayh-Dole Act did was, it allows academic institutions and contractors who make an invention with government funding to own the invention. They have the incentives and the ability to either license it or commercialize it. They have to give a preference if they license it to a small company or somebody who will make the product in the United States. They have to reward the inventors if they have royalties, and the other royalties have to be put back into additional research. The other thing that Bayh-Dole did was it decentralized technology management from Washington to the people actually making the technologies. It gave the government a few rules to oversee and then got the federal bureaucracy out of the way. Bayh-Dole didn't cost the taxpayers an additional dime and didn't create any new bureaucracy, which is really remarkable. The Economist Technology Quarterly said that Bayh-Dole is probably the most inspired piece of legislation passed over the past half century, and that more than anything, it helped stop America's precipitous slide into industrial irrelevance, which many people thought was our inevitable fate in the 1970s. Incredibly, there are now some people who actually want to return us to the pre-Bayh Dole era, despite all the demonstrated successes. One of the most serious threats is the argument that the government should be able to oversee prices of products made from federal funded research licensed under Bayh Dole. That would kill the Bayh Dole Act overnight. No VC is going to fund a small company if after the end of all that effort and you defy the odds to come up with a product, and then anyone can petition the federal government that they don't like your price so the government can license your competitors. So I want to close by saying the Bayh Dole Act works. It's made incredible impact here now. And at a time when we need to get our economy and our people back on their feet, we need to make sure we protect and nurture Bayh Dole and let policymakers know that the law works as it is. And the last thing we want to do now is undermine it in any way. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. And thanks for your great work on the Bayh Dole Act back in 1980 and throughout the intervening 40 years. Those of you may not know, there was a celebration of the 40th anniversary of the Bayh Dole Act last week, and I was on the Zoom webinar, and I think there were 900 people. And it was amazing, including Senator Dole, who made an appearance. Next, we're going to hear from Kathy Koo, who was at Stanford University, I think, as we talked right before, in 1980 when the Bayh Dole Act. And so, Kathy, please give us your perspective and your involvement with the Bayh Dole Act.
Thank you, Ryan. From my perspective, it is hard to overstate the impact of Bayh Dole on American universities and how it shaped the modern view of university research. Because of Bayh Dole, all universities now feel an obligation to help move technologies from early stage research results into the marketplace as part of their public service mission. And because of Bayh Dole, there's been an exponential increase in interest by researchers in general, faculty and students alike. They're all interested in having their research benefit society. All of this focus on innovation has encouraged the entrepreneurial spirit in America and has helped maintain America's economic vibrancy in this ever-competitive world, even now. So, prior to 1980, only a few universities had a technology transfer office. And as Joe said, why should they? It costs money to set up an office with staff. It costs money to file patents. And then the biggest hurdle was to have to ask one of the many agencies of the federal government if the university could take title to an invention that they didn't even know if they would be able to do anything with. No wonder only a few universities ever thought about invention. I started at Stanford in November of 1979, right before the Bayh Dole law was passed. My first job at Stanford wasn't technology transfer per se. Stanford knew that Bayh Dole was being passed, and my job was to enable Stanford to meet its Bayh Dole obligations by helping inventors disclose their invention to the sponsored project contracts and grants. I went to my first SUPA meeting the next February. SUPA stood for the Society of University Patent Administrators. We were just thought of as patent administrators. And honestly, I didn't have a clue. We were a small but committed group of universities, about 70 attendees, Stanford, MIT, Washington University in St. Louis, the University of California. These people were interested in doing technology transfer, but they were just trying to figure out how to develop their own intellectual property policies and maybe some practices. Gradually through the 1980s, because of Bayh Dole, universities one by one started tech transfer offices. By 1990, I think most research universities had established an office, but everyone was still really trying to figure it out. SUPA, University Patent Administrators, became AUTUM, the Association of University Technology Managers, in 1990, and I was president at that time during the transition. But even then, the name change was very controversial. Even in the 1990s, I don't think many people aspired to be in tech transfer. It was still too new of a profession, but I knew it was really, really interesting and fun. So I want to go backwards again in time. At Stanford, Niels Reimers had established a very small, and basically him, an assistant and a student, this licensing office in 1970, so prior to Bayh Dole. He had the foresight to establish an institutional patent agreement, these are called IPAs, with both NIH and NSF, so we were able to do a bit of licensing. Through those agreements, we were able to retain title, the now famous gene splicing patents mentioned earlier, the Cohn-Boyer patent. So the success of this widespread non-exclusive licensing program put Stanford OTL on the map and energized other universities into thinking that maybe they too could be successful at licensing. University licensing and the biotech industry, in my opinion, grew up together because of Bayh Dole. And to me, the vibrancy of the life sciences industry today really depends on the effective licensing of university technology to both startups and biotech, who then partner with life sciences, big pharma. So I don't want to forget the physical science industry. In the early 1980s, when Bayh Dole had passed, but at Stanford, Sun Microsystems, Cisco, MIPS, and many other companies were started based on university technology. The reality is that technology transfer for many of these IT companies was certainly more through people, graduated students and faculty, than patents. But what Bayh Dole had done was amplify the entrepreneurial ecosystem that is the hallmark of Silicon Valley. For Stanford, are well-known companies such as Google and the data visualization company many of you know called Tableau. They were based on Bayh Dole invention. I don't want to talk just about Stanford. Some of the impactful inventions from universities all over the country include Allegra from Georgetown, FluMist from St. Louis University and University of Michigan. There's Lyrica, a drug for neuropathic pain, that was from Northwestern. You have Gleevec, another drug for chronic myeloid leukemia from UCLA. We also have Honeycrisp apples from the University of Minnesota. We have firefighting drones, who we care about in California, from the University of Nebraska. And we had Akamai, the internet trafficking networking system from MIT. Now, whether or not these inventions were Bayh Dole inventions, Bayh Dole created the system for technology transfer and encouraged the environment for entrepreneurial activity. Over many years, we have developed the system to be very effective because we built a cadre of professionals who have learned how to do it. So now I say people do aspire to become technology transfer practitioners. Because of the success of Bayh Dole in the US, many other countries have copied the Bayh Dole model. US universities have clearly been the leaders in the field and have shared their practices throughout the world. It's a very collegiate community. And we've shared with all parts of the world, including many developing countries. I dare say the Bayh Dole has inspired the world to understand that basic research and knowledge can benefit mankind in very tangible ways. I feel that its impact is far greater than I think anyone would have imagined in 1980. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. That's great. Yesterday we had Steve Case, famous venture capitalist, entrepreneur, rise of the rest. And I mean, his thesis is to take more capital around some of those universities, like you mentioned, University of Nebraska, Minnesota, and others, where they're not in Silicon Valley like Stanford. But I think you're right. Bayh Dole seeded many of those ideas and in some sense help build the Venture Capital Association. Mm-hmm. And with that, I'm going to segue to John Stanford, Executive Director of Incubate. And please tell us about Incubate, John, and what its mission and what you're doing there at Incubate.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's such a pleasure to join this panel, in particular, Joe and Kathy, and their stories about the success that Bayh Dole has really been over the last 40 years. I'm executive director of Incubate. We're a coalition of early stage life science participants, basically. We've really recognized that on the growing debate and discussion over the future of biotechnology and biopharmaceutical leadership we see here in the US, that our voice was really missing, in particular the private capital that helps commercialize, that helps drive the success that Joe and Kathy talked about. There's a reliance on private capital, and it's only those investors that will take a very extreme risk that will see some extraordinary home runs, but by and large, we'll see 9 out of 10 failures. And when you look at the debate in Washington, where Incubate does most of its work, about the current state of play for innovation and for medicine, you see a lot of misconstrued facts on both sides of the aisle, a simple lack of awareness about the incredible process that is basic to translational research, to commercialization, to clinical trials, to product development, and finally to a patient. And so we work to inform and educate people on both sides of the aisle to make sure that they really understand the complexity. And so taking a step back to celebrate Bayh Dole is, I think you heard some incredible remarks just before this, but I want to just commend how unique this landmark legislation is. We can point to global competitive success in an entire industry, and in fact, a few industries, solely because of this legislation. I was recently presenting on sort of American dynamism in the life sciences to the European Parliament, and it was pretty easy to draw the parallels back to the decisions made in 1980 and the growth and success of this. And I don't think there are too many other instances in American political history where we can point to a specific piece of legislation and just see its profound effects. And to Joe and to others who helped make these things happen, we are unendingly grateful. And Bayh Dole today is still very much working and very much alive. We have more medicines in our pipeline than ever. And something that I don't think we talk about enough is we have more modalities of medicine than ever. Not only are we seeing more innovation and more development, but we're seeing them in fields we didn't even know were possible. We're also celebrating the 40th anniversary of recombinant DNA. And I think what we're seeing today, whether it's gene therapy, whether it's going to be the increased role of AI to make clinical trial data more effective, whether it's going to be things like mRNA, which of course we've seen in COVID-19 response, our toolkit is growing exponentially. And again, Bayh Dole is at the core of that. So many of these new modalities, let alone new medicines, are byproducts of a commercialization process that has Bayh Dole to thank for it. The industry is thriving and growing. We see more biotechnology companies than ever before. We see more private venture capital coming than ever before. And that speaks to the real golden age that we're living in. And so those are my happy comments. But of course, there are clouds on the horizon, and what's really disturbing to someone like myself who does advocacy full time is these clouds are of our own making. And those clouds exist in Washington. We've proven that the Bayh Dole model can be successful, that it can drive innovation further than we really thought possible. But Incubate was really founded 2 years ago to respond to policy proposals that could fundamentally destabilize the innovation environment. At the time, it was really it's always been about intellectual property and the way in which we can protect it and drive it forward. That manifested itself in a few proposals. One that proposed allowing for compulsory licensing, which is effectively the theft of the patent if we don't like the price of a product. And when I talk to moderate legislators on both sides, I tell them, imagine you don't like the new price of the iPhone. And so we just take the iPhone from Apple and let someone else make it. And they can say, well, that would never happen. Well, it's something that had 200 co-sponsors in the House of Representatives. And so that really concerned the venture community, which up to that point hadn't taken a collective stand and gotten involved in advocacy. And so it was these warning signs on the horizon that really got us involved. But we're seeing now, what you've seen is a step away from threats to intellectual property to some point, and instead looking at ways of installing or importing price controls that would make that intellectual property effectively worthless, and certainly wouldn't allow venture capital, who we have to remember is investing usually our own pension dollars, our own retirement funds, university endowments. I mean, these are our dollars that they're investing. They wouldn't have the fiduciary ability to invest in any of the brimming technologies and medicines if the government could just simply set a price control. So those are the kinds of things we're facing. And the last thing I'll leave you with is, at this point, our industry, our collective innovative body is playing defense. But there is a lot of hope in that. There's so many members of Congress that even if we spend a little time with them, educating them both on the health and economic benefits of an innovative society, really are coming around. And I know the headlines, particularly over the next 24, 48, or 96 hours, are going to be troubling, but you certainly have an advocate in Washington, and we're grateful for AURP inviting us here today and participating in some of Incubate's work. Thank you.
Great, thanks, John. Yeah, one of the things I think we lose sight of with the Bayh Dole Act is it didn't cost any money. I mean, it was essentially a giving permission to university researchers to take title to the patents that weren't being exploited by the government. I'm a big fan of the Endless Frontiers Act, but $100 billion, they're gonna have to find the appropriations for that. So this was an innovation policy that was was launched simply by giving permission for the researchers who using the federal funds to help develop that technology. And one of my favorite quotes from Abraham Lincoln is, patents that are the fuel of interest to the fire of genius. And it really, I mean, that illustrates, I mean, there is self-interest, right? It is property, as John mentioned, but to the fire of genius. And so patents were one of the things that were, mentioned in the Constitution, and they're fundamental to the way we do work. And I would also note the only U.S. president to be awarded a patent was Abraham Lincoln. And for a patent that didn't generate any revenue, Kathy, unfortunately, it was a device to try to move upstream a boat. And it was, at its time, I mentioned revolutionary, but it never generated any revenue. So, Joe, Purdue University is a great member of AURP. They have a number of research parks. Can you talk a little bit about their role in the Bayh Dole Act, of how they helped seed some of the ideas?
Absolutely. It's no exaggeration to say that without Purdue, we would not have Bayh Dole. I worked for Senator Bayh, as I mentioned. He was from Indiana, and I was on the Senate Judiciary Committee staff. So one day we got a call from Senator Bayh's office saying that Purdue wanted to talk to us about some patent issue, and we had no idea what they wanted to talk about, but Birch Bayh was a Purdue alum, so when Purdue called, they came to the front of the line, and Ralph Davis of Purdue came in and said that they'd made some potentially important inventions, but they were going to be taken away because that's the way the government policies work. So Senator Bayh asked me to look into that, and I found out that that was not just one offer for Purdue, it was actually the policy that was across the board. And we also found out that Senator Dole, Senator Bayh was a liberal Democrat, Senator Dole, conservative Republican, had the same interest, because both of us thought, well, that just doesn't make any sense. I mean, who's going to benefit if inventions are taken away? So if it hadn't been for Purdue coming in with actually the University of Wisconsin and the Patent Council at NIH, all of which told us, listen, the taxpayers are not getting the return on investment they deserve because these benefits are just sitting on the shelf and they're not really helping anybody. If Purdue had not come in, you would not have Bayh Dole. And also Ralph was kind enough to testify in the Senate Judiciary Committee on Purdue. So I think the power of universities to influence law makers, as John was just talking about, should not be underestimated. We really need to do a good job of doing that. We could do a lot better than what we're doing. But I think you'll find if you do go in and talk to your representatives and senators, they're interested. They want to help universities, and because Purdue actually went out of their way to do that, that resulted in the Bayh-Dole Act.
Yeah, and one other point about the legislation. I mean, as I recall, it passed in a lame duck session. Like after this November, we'll have a lame duck session, and so it does demonstrate that you can still do some fundamental things, after an election, right? Hopefully, we'll see.
That was a near thing. You don't want to have to do that, but you can. But again, the reason was because we had someone respected on the Democratic side and the Republican side who got people to work together. And our basic argument was we're wasting hundreds of billions of dollars of taxpayer funding. And no matter what your philosophy was, that just didn't make any sense. So I think, you have to have the leadership and the facts. And luckily we had both, but it was a very close thing getting Bayh-Dole across the finish line.
Yeah, I've read about that. Luckily, some things changed, some changes happened. Anyway, it's been a great, in 1980, I was working for the Healthcare Financing Administration, back when there still was, in the Office of Attorney Advisor, and then came to the University of Maryland. And I was reading in the Chronicle of Higher Ed about this law that passed. And eventually I helped start our tech transfer office probably in the mid 80s. It took us some time to find the money. And back then everyone naively thought, set up a tech transfer office and the money will start to roll in, but it's hard work. It takes hard research. It takes a lot of follow-on funding, as John mentions. And I do think the angel investing community, the VC community, all of these have fundamentally, and the research park community, what we represent, have all been fundamentally altered by the Bayh-Dole Act, because if you didn't have places where these companies can locate, and you didn't have angel investors and VCs, if you didn't own the underlying intellectual property, nothing will happen. But I want to put this, I talk to people all the time about Bayh-Dole, and there is, some, if you're not informed, you say, wait a minute, the taxpayers paid for this. Why should we be paying it for it twice? And so all three of you, can you sort of give the response to that kind of commonsensical argument I sometimes hear when we talk about the Bayh-Dole Act? Why federal government already paid for it? Why aren't we paying for it twice?
First crack?
Yeah. I mean, all of you. I mean, have at it. This is a debate.
I've already talked. Let John go.
So to me, from a university
John,
perspective, having the ability to just, it's like you need to raise a baby into an adulthood. Somebody needs to care about that initial idea and say, this is a good idea. We invest in it with the initial intellectual property support for that idea. But it takes industry and financing and everything else to grow that idea into a real product in the marketplace. But if nobody even starts with the idea, if nobody even thinks this idea is worth pursuing at all, it's never even going to happen. It never has a chance to get out of the cocoon, I guess. It's really important for the American people to understand that federal funded research is about research. You're not necessarily looking for invention, although invention comes out of it. If an invention comes out of it, it is a fortuitous event. And then it takes way, way, way more money to develop this embryonic idea. Again, it's very hard to bring early stage research to the marketplace.
And John?
Yeah, building on what Kathy said, one of our VCs was presenting to a bunch of NIH staffers, academics, and some other investors. And she did a quick poll of the audience that I think is instructive. She asked anyone in the room, would you ever take a product that came right out of the NIH? And not a single hand went up. And she said, of course not, because there's a good chance it would kill you. And that is, to me, the answer to that question. What we get out of our governments and their grant-funded pieces is amazing discovery and science. but it is not drug development. They are doing incredible groundbreaking research in the effects of disease, what happens to the human body when it suffers from a malady, ways to extend our lifetimes and things like that. But they are not drug developers, to Kathy's point. And the investment done by the federal government is tremendous, but it is a small contribution compared to the total cost of producing these drugs, which nowadays run into the multiples of billions of dollars. The number that gets cited most is 2.6 billion. As you look at different types of drugs, it can be much higher. It can also be lower. That's the power of an average. But at the end of the day, the government takes, and through its grant system, takes an important first step for science, but it is the first step of a very long journey, to Kathy's point. And I think it's really important we say the NIH and the grants, they do some incredible discovery, but they do not do drug development. That is done impressively by private capital and by and large, private corporations, small and large. And because of that, we have never seen so much medicine developed in one country in the history of mankind. And that all ties back to Bayh Dole.
Yeah, and I know NIST has
if I could just add one other
Go ahead, Jeff.
Can I just add one thing real quick?
Sure.
That's a complete misperception because the government is funding research for two purposes: basic research and mission research. It is not developing products. A federally funded invention is more like an idea than a product. And back to NIH. NIH estimates it takes $100 of industry development for every $1 of NIH research funding to create a product side, not the government side. Brian just mentioned that Bayh Dole 40, which I had a celebration last year, the 40th anniversary of Bayh Dole. We had Kathy Memora from University of California was on. She worked with one of her researchers for 18 years of their life to develop a breakthrough cancer therapy. For 18 years, they had a hard time finding a company that would commercialize it. People didn't believe in it. The Food and Drug Administration was such different that they almost rejected it. It's become one of the major breakthroughs. But again, the development was done by the industry people, not the government side. And that's such a misunderstanding to try to act like the government is developing products. It is not developing products at all. And as John said, we don't want them developing products, and they don't want to develop products. That's not what they do best.
Excellent. Yeah, well, Joe, I know you had your celebration last week. I think there were 800, 900 people, including Senator Bob Dole making an appearance. And just to hear the stories, including the woman who had the cancer treatment, it was quite remarkable to hear some of those. So I hope our congressional folks can somehow get exposed to some of those stories. And a reminder that NIST has a peer prize challenge that's open through November 20th on ways to improve Bayh Dole compliance by universities. So if you're a university tech transfer member or get involved with your tech transfer, make sure you go onto the NIST website and take a look at that peer challenge. And I think Joe and John and Kathy mentioned a number of countries. I know when I've done work around the world, a lot of countries have adopted sort of the Bayh Dole Act. So can you talk about Canada and any other kinds of countries that are adopted a Bayh Dole Act, and also what can we do to improve the Bayh Dole Act? I mean, is it perfect? What needs to be done? Do we need more investing on? I'm looking at John since he's the investor. Do we need more companies helping universities invest in these technologies? So one of you answered the question about international. Who else has adopted it, and specifically, does Canada have a Bayh Dole Act?
This is Kathy.
Canada does not have a Bayh Dole Act. Canada does is they allow each university to sort of make up its own policy, which I think is frankly one of the reasons they have not had more things commercialized, but that's my personal preference. But I think we've got like 40 countries around the world, China, the UK, Germany. I mean, it's a whole long list, including developing countries like South Africa. I was in Kazakhstan a couple of years ago, so Japan has one. So as Kathy said, Bayh-Dole has become the recognized gold standard because it provides incentives and then lets entrepreneurs take the risk. And as John mentioned and Kathy, most times they're going to fail, but that failure is borne by the private sector, not the public sector. And I think that's the genius of Bayh-Dole is it doesn't put the public at risk as far as putting their money on the table. They're funding research, but the industry people have an incentive now to actually take these ideas, working with universities and federal laboratories, and turn them into products. So it's made a huge impact on our economy. And as Brian said, Bayh-Dole has become the recognized gold standard for most countries in the world.
I'd like to add my comment. There are a few countries, and I think Sweden is still one of them, where they don't do Bayh-Dole. What they do is say that the faculty can keep the invention. But the problem with that, and this is why I talked about the system that Bayh-Dole enabled, was that if you give the invention title to an inventor and they do a deal, whether good or bad, they don't teach anybody else how to do it. So again, whatever expertise they develop or knowledge they acquire resides only with that one person. But in the US, because we've developed the whole system, we share with each other. And so again, this Bayh-Dole system has helped really create the entrepreneur environment and best practices. If you didn't have a system, there wouldn't be any sharing.
John?
I think there's a corollary to their point. Bayh-Dole is a pillar of innovation, but it's not the only one. And that's why in some of the other countries that even have Bayh-Dole, you also have to have a respect for sort of the free market and a role for the private sector to develop these. And so, you can find a country, I think it's sort of a squares and rectangles thing. There are countries that do have Bayh-Dole laws, but are not seeing biopharmaceutical development. But there are no countries that have great biopharmaceutical development that does not have something like Bayh-Dole in place. And I think there are other elements of the recipe. And what concerns me the most is we are beginning to mess with the other elements of the recipe that could make Bayh-Dole irrelevant. And I say that to say, there's no talk in Washington of repealing Bayh-Dole. It is cemented. Joe's good work, his boss's good work will be there. But if we make the investing appetite, if we begin to have price controls on these products such that there can't be a return on investment, then it won't matter that we have this great tech transfer system. And that's what the other countries have done wrong. This is why Europe, which used to be the gold standard for drug development, you look at the names of some of these companies and they're clearly European, but that's not where the science is happening anymore. And that's because they have walked away from protection of IP. They've walked away from industrial policy plans that welcome innovation. You see China as a corollary that is building up strong gold IP, building up strong IP standards. And I think there's a lot of complexity in the Chinese drug development market, but we're seeing them outpace from a policy standpoint, Europe. And so I think there are other places that are incorporating Bayh-Dole. They need to incorporate other things as well, including more robust IP protections down the line from the tech transfer if they want to see that. And Brian, there was a second, the second piece, maybe then I'll kick it back over, is what can we do? Is it perfect? I don't think any law is ever perfect. It's a living, breathing thing. And so I think we need to continue to make sure the other elements that rely on Bayh-Dole remain strong. But I can't point to something that works quite as effectively in all of economic policy as Bayh-Dole, quite honestly. And so I wouldn't tinker with it too much. It works. We just have to come to appreciate that it works.
So obviously, one of the issues that's driving some of the things John has been talking about is drug prices, right? I mean, it's one of the few things Elizabeth Warren and Trump kind of, it's the left and right sort of get together on this. So what should we be doing about drug prices?
I'm going to step in.
Yes,
I feel
please.
like University and Bayh Dole, we're not the problem and we're not the solution. I feel like the government is looking in the wrong place. They should figure some other place to try to tweak.
I think Kathy is exactly right. We are looking for the solution in the wrong place. From Incubate's standpoint, we believe patient affordability is critical, and drug pricing is an element of that. But we also need to propose solutions that actually get patients to be able to afford that. To us, that looks a lot like capping or removing out-of-pocket costs as it relates to medicines. Insurance really needs to be insurance and needs to cover the cost of medicines, whatever they may be. And I think that's where the debate needs to focus. The proposals that came from the president, that came in HR 3, that would install price controls from other countries, did nothing to ensure that patients could afford that. And more than anything means that we won't have another generation of new drugs and new medicines 10 years from now.
Joe, you want to jump in here? Or?
Well, I agree with what John and Kathy have said. I mean, the worst thing we can do is to hamstring innovation trying to control prices. Drug development is an expensive process. It's high risk. It's one of the most expensive things you can possibly get into, with a 95% chance of failure. There's a number of issues for that, but as Kathy said, technology transfer is not the reason. And where the critics go wrong is they think that you can penalize companies that have finally succeeded and people are going to continue to make drugs. That's not going to happen. They'll walk away. In fact, Congress forced the National Institutes of Health to put a reasonable pricing clause on their extramural agreements with industry, and companies walked away. Prices didn't go down, the companies just walked. And that's the worst of all outcomes, is to hurt innovation, and you're not driving prices down. So, we need to have we need to have a scalpel for this, a scalpel, not a sledgehammer.
All right. Well, with that, we're getting close to our 3 o'clock stopping time. Again, I want to thank Joe for your great work, Kathy, John, and again, go out and we'll have the virtual happy hour on Friday, and we'll celebrate Bayh Dole's 40th anniversary. Thank you all. Stay tuned at 3:15 for our next session on healthy air, healthy buildings, happy tenants. So see you back at 3:15, and we have a 15-minute break. Thank you again, panel, for a great discussion.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.